Alright, let me set the scene for you. This happened a few months back, and I still get chills thinking about it. You know how Subway is usually this pretty chill, mundane place where you just grab a sandwich and go? Well, this night was anything but normal. It was late, around 9:30 p.m., and I was coming back from a long day at work. I was starving, and the thought of making something at home just seemed exhausting. So I figured I'd stop by the Subway near my apartment. It was one of those places that's open until 10 p.m., so I had a bit of time. When I walked in, the place was almost empty. There was just one guy behind the counter and a couple of people sitting at a table in the back. The first thing that struck me was how quiet it was. You know how usually there's some music playing or the sound of people talking? Not that night. It was dead silent, except for the hum of the soda machine. I approached the counter, and the guy working there seemed off. He was young, maybe in his early 20s, but he had this distant look in his eyes. Like, he wasn't really there, you know? He didn't greet me or anything, just stared at me as if he was waiting for me to say something. It made me feel uneasy right away. I gave him my order, a simple turkey and cheese on wheat, nothing fancy. He just nodded and started making it, but his movements were slow, almost mechanical, like he was going through the motions without actually thinking about it. I tried to shake off the weird vibe. Maybe he was just having a bad day or something. As I waited, I glanced around the place. The two people in the back caught my eye. They were both just sitting there, not talking, not eating, just sitting. One of them, a woman, was staring down at her sandwich like it was the most interesting thing in the world. The other, a man, was looking straight ahead, eyes fixed on the wall. It was eerie, but I tried to brush it off. Maybe they were just lost in thought or something. The guy behind the counter finished making my sandwich and handed it to me without a word. He didn't even ask if I wanted any extra toppings or anything, just wrapped it up and slid it across the counter. I paid and took my sandwich to a table near the window. At this point, I was just eager to eat and get out of there. I unwrapped my sandwich and took a bite, trying to focus on my phone and not on the weird atmosphere around me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The whole place felt wrong, like I had stepped into some alternate reality. Then something caught my eye. The two people in the back, they were both looking at me now. Not in a casual, curious way, but in this intense, almost predatory way. It made my skin crawl. I looked away, trying to pretend I hadn't noticed, but I could feel their eyes on me. It was like they were waiting for something. I forced myself to keep eating, hoping that if I just ignored them, they would go back to whatever they were doing. But they didn't. Every time I glanced up, they were still staring, their expressions blank and unsettling. The woman had this slight smile on her face, like she knew something I didn't. The guy was just expressionless, but his eyes were so wide it was unnerving. I looked over at the guy behind the counter, thinking maybe he'd noticed too, but he was gone. The area behind the counter was empty. It was like he'd vanished. Now that really freaked me out. I hadn't seen him leave, hadn't heard a door open or close. He was just gone. I felt this chill run down my spine, and I started to feel trapped, like I needed to get out of there. I wrapped up the rest of my sandwich and stood up, trying to act casual even though I was starting to panic. The moment I stood, the two in the back stood up too. It was like they were mirroring my movements, getting up at the exact same time. They still hadn't said a word, and their eyes were locked on me. I started walking towards the door, my heart pounding in my chest. The closer I got to the exit, the more I could feel their gaze drilling into the back of my head. It took everything in me not to break into a run. I pushed the door open and stepped outside, taking a deep breath of the cool night air. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, but it was short-lived. As I turned around, I caught a glimpse of them through the window. They were both standing by the table, staring at me through the glass. The woman had that creepy smile on her face, and the guy was just expressionless, his eyes unblinking. And then the lights inside flickered and went out, plunging the place into darkness. I didn't stick around to see what happened next. I bolted to my car, jumped in, and locked the doors. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the keys, trying to start the engine. I looked back at the subway through the windshield, but it was just dark now, like the whole place had been abandoned. I finally managed to start the car and sped out of there. I drove straight home, not stopping until I was safely inside my apartment with all the doors locked. I tried to make sense of what had just happened, but I couldn't. It was like something out of a horror movie, not real life, but I knew what I saw and I knew how it made me feel. For days after that, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I went out, I felt like someone was following me, even though I never saw anyone. I started avoiding that subway, taking different routes to work just so I wouldn't have to drive by it. I never went back. A couple of weeks later, I was talking to a friend about it, trying to make sense of it all, and they suggested we go check the place out together in the daytime just to see if it was still as creepy. So we did. We went back, and when we got there, the place was closed. Not just closed for the day, but permanently shut down. The windows were boarded up, and there was a sign saying the building was for lease. It didn't make any sense. I had been there just a couple of weeks before, late at night, but the place looked like it had been abandoned for months. We even asked around, but no one seemed to know anything about it. It was like the place had just vanished overnight. I don't know what happened that night. Maybe it was some weird prank, or maybe I just stumbled into something I wasn't supposed to see. All I know is that I'll never forget those eyes staring at me, watching my every move, and that feeling of dread, like I was being drawn into something dark and sinister, has stayed with me ever since. Every now and then, when I'm out late at night, I get that same feeling, like someone's watching me. I'll turn around, expecting to see those two from the subway, but there's never anyone there. Just the empty street and the shadows. But I know they're out there somewhere, watching, waiting. So yeah, that's my story. I don't go to subways anymore. And whenever I pass by one, I can't help but look through the window, half expecting to see those two faces staring back at me. I had this routine where I'd hit up the subway near my apartment every couple of weeks. It was one of those small ones tucked into the corner of a strip mall, always clean, well lit, and usually pretty quiet. I liked going there because it was a quick way to grab a decent meal without dealing with too much hassle. Plus, they had that one employee, Dave, who was always super friendly. We weren't exactly friends, but we'd chat whenever I stopped by. Just small talk about the weather, sports, that kind of thing. So this one night, I was craving a sandwich and decided to drop by Subway. It was a bit later than usual, maybe around 9 p.m. I remember the parking lot being emptier than usual, just a couple of cars scattered around. I didn't think much of it and headed inside. The bell above the door chimed as I walked in, and I immediately noticed something was off. Dave wasn't there. Instead, there was this new guy behind the counter. He looked up as I walked in, but didn't say anything. No smile, no welcome to Subway, nothing. Just this blank stare. It made me a little uneasy, but I tried to brush it off. I mean, maybe he was just having a bad day or something. So I stepped up to the counter and started giving him my order. He just nodded and started preparing my sandwich without a word. As he worked, I couldn't help but notice how he moved. It was slow, almost robotic, like he was going through the motions without really thinking about it. And his eyes, man, they were something else. Cold and detached, not like someone who's just tired or bored, but more like he was somewhere else entirely. I tried to ignore it, focusing on my phone while he worked, but I could feel this tension building in the room. When he finally finished, he wrapped up the sandwich and handed it over without even looking at me. I paid, mumbled a quick thanks, and went to sit down at one of the tables. Normally, I would have just taken my food to go, but something made me want to sit there for a bit. Maybe I wanted to keep an eye on this guy. I don't know. I unwrapped my sandwich and took a bite, glancing up at the guy behind the counter. He was just standing there, staring off into space. It was like he was waiting for something, or maybe listening for something I couldn't hear. Every so often, he'd glance over at me, and I'd quickly look down at my sandwich or my phone, pretending I hadn't noticed. But it was hard not to. There was this tension in the air, this creeping sense of unease that I couldn't shake. I tried to distract myself by scrolling through my phone, but I kept getting this feeling that I was being watched. I glanced up, and sure enough, he was staring right at me. This time, he didn't look away. He just kept staring, his eyes locked on mine. I felt a chill run down my spine and quickly looked back at my phone, my hands shaking a little. After a few minutes, I couldn't take it anymore. I wrapped up the rest of my sandwich, stuffed it into the bag, and got up to leave. As I walked toward the door, I could feel his eyes on me, following my every move. I pushed open the door and practically sprinted to my car. fumbling with the keys as I tried to unlock it. I finally got in, started the engine, and glanced back at the subway. He was standing in the doorway, watching me, not moving, not smiling, just watching. I drove off, my heart pounding in my chest. I kept telling myself it was nothing, that maybe he was just weird or having a bad day. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The whole drive home, I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see his face staring back at me, but there was nothing. A few days went by, and I started to feel like maybe I was overreacting. I mean, people can be weird, right? Not everyone is going to be all smiles and sunshine all the time. I tried to put it out of my mind, but every time I thought about going back to Subway, that feeling of unease would creep back in. Then, one night, something weird happened. I was sitting in my living room, watching TV, when I heard a noise outside. It was this faint scratching sound, like something brushing against the side of the house. I muted the TV and listened, my heart rate starting to pick up. The sound stopped, and for a moment, there was nothing, just silence. I told myself it was probably just the wind or an animal, but then it happened again. This time it was louder, more distinct. I got up and went to the window, peeking through the blinds. The street was empty, nothing out of the ordinary. I stood there for a while, waiting to see if it would happen again, but it didn't. So I went back to my couch, trying to shake off the feeling of unease. The next morning, I went out to my car and noticed something strange. There were smudges on the windows, like someone had been pressing their hands against the glass. I stood there for a moment, staring at the marks, trying to make sense of it. It didn't make any sense. My car was parked right in front of my apartment. Someone would have seen if there was a break-in, and nothing was missing. But those smudges, they creeped me out. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, so I just wiped them off and went about my day. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. The more I thought about it, the more paranoid I got. I started triple-checking my locks, closing all the blinds at night, and even sleeping with a light on. I felt ridiculous, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. A couple of nights later, it happened again. I was in bed, trying to fall asleep, when I heard that same scratching sound. But this time, it was coming from my bedroom window. My heart started pounding in my chest as I lay there, listening. The sound was soft at first, almost like someone was lightly tapping their nails against the glass. I didn't want to look, but I had to know what it was. I slowly got out of bed and crept over to the window. I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over the edge of the blinds. I took a deep breath and yanked them open. Nothing. Just darkness and the reflection of my own terrified face staring back at me. I let out a shaky breath and closed the blinds, backing away from the window. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shadow moving past the edge of the window. Just a brief glimpse of something passing by. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, not daring to move or make a sound. I stood there, straining to hear anything, but all I got was silence. It was like whoever or whatever was out there was waiting for me to let my guard down. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, whispering into the receiver that someone was outside my house. They told me to stay on the line, that they were sending someone over. I stayed there, huddled in the corner of my bedroom, clutching my phone like a lifeline. It felt like hours before I finally heard the sirens in the distance. The police showed up, and I ran to the door to let them in. They searched the property, but they didn't find anything. No signs of forced entry, no footprints, nothing. They said it was probably just an animal, maybe a raccoon or something, and told me to call if anything else happened. I tried to take their word for it, to convince myself that it was nothing, but I knew better. I knew someone had been out there, watching me, and it wasn't an animal. It was him, the guy from Subway. I don't know how I knew, but I did. I could feel it. The next day, I went to my car and found another set of smudges on the windows. This time, they were more distinct, like handprints. My stomach dropped, and I felt this wave of nausea wash over me. I knew it wasn't my imagination. Someone was messing with me, and I had no idea why. I thought about calling the police again, but what would I say? That some guy from Subway was stalking me? They'd think I was crazy. So I tried to go about my life, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I left the house, every time I came back, I was looking over my shoulder, waiting for something to happen. A few weeks went by, and nothing else happened. I started to think maybe it was over, that maybe I was just being paranoid. I even went back to that subway a couple of times, but the guy wasn't there. Just the regular staff, all friendly and normal. It was almost enough to make me believe I'd imagined the whole thing. But then, one night, I got home late from work. I was exhausted, just wanting to get inside and crash on the couch. I pulled into the driveway, turned off the engine, and got out of the car. As I walked to the front door, I got this feeling, like the hairs on the back of my neck were standing up. I stopped and looked around, but everything was quiet. The street was empty, nothing out of place. I took a deep breath and turned back to the door, but something caught my eye. There, in the corner of the porch, was a sandwich bag. It looked just like the ones they use at Subway. My heart sank as I walked over to it, my hands shaking. I picked it up and looked inside. It was empty, except for a single napkin. I pulled it out, and written on it, in smeared black ink, were the words, "See you soon." I dropped the bag and stumbled back, my heart racing. I ran inside, locking the door behind me, and called the police. They came out, but again, they didn't find anything. No fingerprints, no evidence, nothing. Just an empty sandwich bag and a napkin with a creepy message. Alright, let me tell you about this weird experience I had at a Subway once. It was one of those random weekday nights, you know? I was coming home late from work, around 9 p.m., and just couldn't be bothered to cook. So I thought I'd grab a sandwich from Subway since it's quick, and I can get it exactly how I want. I walked in, and the place was almost deserted, which was strange because this Subway is usually packed around that time. There was only one guy in line ahead of me, and he looked kind of sketchy, wearing this old dirty jacket and a beanie pulled low over his face. I didn't think much of it, just figured he was some guy down on his luck. But there was something about him that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. You know that feeling? Like when you just get a bad vibe from someone? Anyway, I shrugged it off and ordered my usual. A footlong with turkey, lots of veggies, and just a bit of mayo. I was trying to focus on my order, but I kept catching this guy in my peripheral vision. He was staring at me, but not in a casual way. It was this intense, almost predatory stare. I tried to ignore it, thinking maybe he was just spacing out or something. He paid for his food and moved to the corner of the restaurant, still watching me. I grabbed my sandwich and decided to sit at the opposite end, as far away from him as possible. The whole time I was sitting there, I felt like I was under a microscope. Every bite I took, every time I looked at my phone, I could feel his eyes on me. It was like he was waiting for something, but I had no idea what. Now, the Subway was practically empty, except for the two of us. The employees were busy in the back, maybe restocking or something, so it felt like it was just me and this guy. I tried to act normal, focusing on my food, but I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't want to make eye contact with him, but I was so aware of his presence that I couldn't help but glance up every now and then. Every time I looked up, his eyes were locked on me. He wasn't eating, just sitting there with his sandwich in front of him, completely still. It was unnerving, to say the least. I thought about leaving, but I didn't want to seem paranoid or make a scene. Besides, my car was parked a little bit away, and the thought of him following me to the parking lot sent shivers down my spine. After what felt like an eternity, I decided I had enough. I wrapped up the rest of my sandwich and started packing up my stuff. I figured if I made a quick exit, I could get to my car before he had a chance to do anything. But as soon as I stood up, he did too. My heart dropped. He hadn't even touched his food, but now he was ready to leave? I tried to stay calm, walking at a normal pace to the door. I could hear his footsteps behind me, not too close, but definitely following. I pushed the door open, and the cold night air hit me like a slap in the face. I glanced around, looking for other people, but the street was empty. Just my luck. I made a beeline for my car, my keys already in hand. I could hear him behind me, the sound of his footsteps speeding up. My car was only a few feet away, but it felt like miles. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might explode. I was about to unlock the door when I felt a hand on my shoulder. I whipped around, my keys held up like a makeshift weapon. The guy stepped back, hands up like he meant no harm, but his eyes were wide and wild. "Sorry," he muttered. "I think you dropped this." He held out a crumpled piece of paper. I didn't remember dropping anything, but my brain was too scrambled to think straight. I snatched the paper from his hand and backed away, fumbling with my car door. I got in, locked the doors, and finally allowed myself to breathe. I watched as he just stood there, staring at me through the windshield, not moving. I unfolded the piece of paper, my hands shaking. It was a napkin from Subway, and on it was a single word scrawled in messy handwriting: "Run." I didn't know what to make of it. Was he warning me? Was this some kind of sick joke? My mind was racing with a million questions, but I didn't stick around to find out. I put the car in reverse and peeled out of the parking lot as fast as I could. As I drove away, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting him to be following me, but he was just standing there in the middle of the parking lot, watching me leave. I couldn't shake the feeling that something really bad was about to happen, but I didn't know what. I didn't want to know. I got home and immediately double-checked all the locks on my doors and windows. I felt stupid for being so paranoid, but there was this gnawing feeling in my gut that something wasn't right. I couldn't stop thinking about that guy, about the look in his eyes and that napkin. I tossed and turned all night, jumping at every little sound. It wasn't until the next day that I heard the news. There had been an incident at that same Subway just an hour after I left. A robbery gone wrong, they said. One of the employees was injured, but thankfully they were going to be okay. The suspect? They didn't have a clear description, just a vague image from the security cameras. But I knew who it was. It had to be him. I don't know if he was planning to do something to me or if he was trying to warn me. Maybe both. But every time I think about that night, I can't help but feel like I dodged a bullet. What if I had stayed a little longer? What if I hadn't noticed him staring? There are so many what-ifs that it drives me crazy sometimes. I haven't been back to that Subway since. In fact, I can't really go to any Subway without feeling that unease creeping up my spine. It's like every time I walk into one, I'm expecting to see him sitting in the corner, watching me. I know it's irrational, but once you get that kind of scare, it's hard to shake off. Even now, sometimes when I'm out late at night, I'll catch myself looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that guy with his wild eyes. I tell myself it's just paranoia, but part of me wonders if he's still out there, watching, waiting. And that thought, it's the kind of thing that keeps you up at night, staring at the ceiling, jumping at every little noise, wondering if maybe, just maybe, you should have listened to that napkin.